already gotten started with some of the discussion. I'm just going to mute everyone's lines for now to make sure we don't get too much background noise. Susie will definitely unmute you. Before we get started, wanted to thank everyone for joining today. Specifically want to thank the Sisterhood for sponsoring this initiative and to Faye for organizing all of this. We will have 7 more conversations like this over the next few months on Wednesday evenings with different Jewish authors and about different writings, some Jewish writings in there too. And the purpose is really for people to enjoy, to connect with some new materials and authors that they might already be familiar with or they might not be yet. So looking forward to getting this first one started. If you have any feedback about the event, feel free to send it our way and we'll take it into account for the future events. With that, want to introduce everyone to Susie Orman Schnall. Susie is the award-winning author of the novels We Came Here to Shine, The Subway Girls, The Balance Project, and On Grace. Her writing has appeared in numerous publications, including the New York Times, Huffington Post, Pop Sugar, Writer's Digest, Harper's Bazaar, and Glamour. And she's also a frequent speaker at women's groups, corporations, libraries, bookstores, and book clubs. Susie grew up in Los Angeles, graduated from the University of Pennsylvania, and now lives in New York with her husband and their 3 teenage sons. Before we dive into the questions, want to share a link to Susie's most recent book, We Came Here to Shine, in the chat with all of you. Okay. And this is the book we're going to be talking about today. If anyone's in the middle of it or hasn't started it yet, do not worry. We will not spoil the ending or give anything away. And we expect tonight to last just about 45 minutes. We'll spend the first portion of it. I'll ask questions to Susie and hear her answers. If there's questions that come up during this initial part, feel free to write them in the chat and we'll take them as we go. And at the end, we'll specifically set aside time for questions. And during that time, everyone is welcome to unmute themselves and ask questions that way or continue to send questions in through the chat. All right. So Susie, I wanted to start off by asking you just a little bit about what the book's about and your inspiration behind writing it.
Thank you, Gila. It's so nice to be here. I appreciate your having me. And Faye, is Faye on here? Oh, there's Faye. Okay, I can't see you, but thank you so much for inviting me. And I'm really honored to be with your synagogue tonight. What my bio doesn't say is that I'm actually originally from Philadelphia. My father grew up in Philly. He grew up in Hatboro and Cheltenham. My grandfather was a doctor in internal medicine and apparently holds the record for having the longest career at Abington Hospital. So if anybody knows the name Orman, does anybody know the name Orman? My grandfather was Morty Orman, but I have a lot of family in Philadelphia, and so I have a affinity towards you all because I feel like you're all family to me, and I love the Philadelphia accent. It reminds me of my childhood. My father worked for Atlantic Richfield Company, and in 1972 they moved their headquarters from Philadelphia to Los Angeles, which is how we ended up there. So now that you know I'm really one of y'all, I'm happy to talk about the book, and thanks again so much for having me. So We Came Here to Shine is uplifting historical fiction set at the 1939 New York World's Fair. And it is about 2 bold and ambitious women who are pursuing their personal and professional ambitions at the fair. One is Vivi, and again, I'm not going to give anything away, but Vivi is when the book opens, she is an aspiring Hollywood actress who is about to start filming the first day of her first leading role. And the studio head unceremoniously plucks her from that filming and tells her he's shipping her off to New York City to work at the Aquacade. which was the swimming and dancing production put on by Billy Rose at the World's Fair. She's devastated because not only does she think that it's going to ruin her career right when it's just kicking off, but she has unpleasant family memories in New York that she does not want to return to. My second character is Max, and she is a young Jewish woman who's from the Upper West Side of Manhattan, and she is a junior at NYU studying journalism, and her big dream is to work for the New York Times. She is in a very prestigious cohort of students at NYU who have the opportunity, their professor places them at summer internships. And all Max wants is the Times, but unfortunately for her, her professor instead puts her at the daily newspaper of the World's Fair. So you now have these two young women who want to be anywhere else but where they are for the summer, and they have to deal with obstacles in their way at their jobs and in their personal lives, and eventually they work together to make their dreams happen. The third character really is the World's Fair itself, and I take the reader behind the scenes to this extraordinary and iconic moment in history. I show you all the exhibitions and the buildings and what it was like and some of the history of how it became, because there is just so much about the World's Fair that's interesting, all the innovations and the technological introductions that happen there. So the way that I came up with writing this book is I was actually reading, I have props, I was reading this book, which is The $1 Million, sorry, it's backwards, The $1 Million Mermaid by Esther Williams. This is her autobiography. And for those of you who don't know Esther Williams, she was a very famous swimmer. When she was 19 years old, she was working for a department store in Los Angeles, and she got a call from Billy Rose inviting her to audition for the 1940 aquacade that was going to be held at the World's Fair in San Francisco on Treasure Island, which was called the Golden Gate Exposition. So I'm reading this and I get to the word aquacade and I said, aquacade, what's an aquacade? I'd never heard that word before. So I looked it up on Google and found that the aquacade was the highest grossing attraction of the 1939 World's Fair. And I became captivated by the history of it. And of course, reading about the aquacade led me to read about the World's Fair. And that just opened a whole world for me. And I thought it would be a great setting to plop down two young women and see what they could do in this wonderful carnival of riches and excitement. So that's how the idea for the book came about.
Got it. That's very cool and interesting. What kind of research went into the book?
Yeah, so historical fiction is interesting in the sense that the research is incredibly important because the reader needs to be able to believe that what he or she or they is reading is authentic. And of course, being historical fiction, I, as the author, am allowed to take liberty, but it can't go too far to inauthenticate the book itself. So the research was important and I spent a lot of time on it. And I first started with books. I have a huge stack of books. You know what, I'm going to share my screen for a second because I think that it would be interesting for you all to see some pictures of the research. So I'm gonna bear with me for 1 second. Share, play. Okay, Gila, can you do a thumbs up if you can see a stack of books on your screen? Yes, okay. So this is just a portion of the books that I read to do research for this. Some of them were about the World's Fair. As you can see on the top is Billy Rose's autobiography, which is wonderful and a lot of fun. He was a brilliant writer. I studied the Hollywood studio system because, as I said, Vivi, one of my main characters, works for a studio, and I wanted to make sure that I got that right. I read books about women in journalism because women in the middle of the last century, it was, journalism wasn't an easy field for them to enter into. Women were typically working, if they got a job as writers at all, and not just stenographers or typists, they worked for the women's pages and wrote articles about interior design and gardening and recipes, which is what the men thought that the women would be interested in. There were some female foreign correspondents, but for the most part, it wasn't common for a woman to write hard news. So I wanted to study that. I also used this website, which is what I looked up the seal test, the craft on when I was just telling you a little bit about that. This is 1939 nyworldsfair.com for anybody who's interested. And this is an incredibly comprehensive and robust archive of everything and anything anybody would want to know about the World's Fair. They talk about every zone. There were 7 zones of the fair, plus the theme center, which is the Trilon and Perisphere, which are those architectural icons you can see right there in that photograph. But every building is described, and there's just so much information on here. So it was very helpful before I started writing, and then while I was writing, if I wanted more detail on something, something like a menu of a restaurant, or how tall a building was, it's all in here. There's a lot of video about the fair. On the left is a screen grab from the Medicus collections. Philip Medicus was an amateur videographer, and he took 17 reels of video. And it's just wonderful to watch people walking through the fair, seeing what they wore. I was able to watch video of the aquacade performances, video of the Lifesavers parachute jump, which we were talking about. So it's a really rich collection. And the right-hand screen grab is from the Westinghouse's internal movie, which they distributed, which was called The Middleton Family at the World's Fair. And it's about a typical Midwestern family. It's about an hour long, and they visit the fair. And so it goes in depth into Westinghouse's exhibitions, which were really incredible and some of my favorite ones. But it also gives insight as to what was going on in the fair in general. And again, just photos of video of what people look like and all that. I bought a lot of keepsakes of memorabilia off of eBay. This is just a selection of some of the postcards that I bought. And what was really fun was some of them came already filled out. And so I got to read what people wrote home to their family and their friends. And I also bought, why am I blanking on what these are called? Little souvenirs, little trinkets of costume jewelry. And I originally had bought all of these things because on my book tour, I was hoping to present to my audiences kind of like a living library of memorabilia from the fair. But alas, all of my book tour events have been sitting here in my office, so I can only show you the slides. This is an original guidebook from the fair that I have right here. And it's great because I have a lot of books that talk about what the fair was like, but this is actually what the Fair Corporation put out. So it's their words and how they wanted it to be. And then one of the most exciting finds was Today at the Fair, which was an actual daily newspaper that the fair put out. So I knew that I wanted a character to be a journalist, but that was before I learned that there was actually a paper that was sold on the grounds for 5 cents a day. And just reading through these newspapers was so wonderful because I got to read about all of the different exhibits. And I mean, daily there were hundreds of different events and exhibits and bands and performances and special days for, certain groups of people. So that was great. And it allowed me to get insight so that my character, I knew what she was going to be writing about. This is a program from the Aquacade that has wonderful descriptions of the performances and advertisements and bios of the stars. This is the Heinz Pickle Pin. Some of you might recognize this from other fairs or carnivals you might have gone to in your lives, but the Pickle Pin was the most popular souvenir from the World's Fair. It was free at the Heinz Pickle Dome, where they had the 57 varieties and had exhibits of all their different food. And finally, this was really the pinnacle of my research. This was going to the World's Fair site in Flushing Meadows, Queens. And there's very little left from the 1939 fair. Behind me in the tour guide there in the center photo is the Unisphere, and that's from the 64-65 fair. But what is the same is the footprint. And whereas the 39-40 fair was almost double the size of the 64 fair, the layout was similar, and it allowed me the opportunity to walk the paths that my character would have walked, to walk the paths that the millions of people who came from all over the world to these World's Fairs walked. And that was really, really something wonderful. So I'm going to stop my share of that and go back to our conversation. So that's the research that I did.
Wow. That's great. And is that, I know you've written other books as well. Have you followed kind of that similar really immersive process for those books too?
I have. Well, my first two novels were On Grace and the Balance Project were more contemporary fiction. Um, and so I didn't really need to do very much research for that. The first one is about a woman turning 40, and that was kind of my life experience at the time. So I was able to pull a lot of that just from my own life. And the second one, The Balance Project, was about work-life balance, but from a fictional perspective. And for that, I had done a series of interviews about women and work-life balance. So I did research for that, but it wasn't the same as when I wrote The Subway Girls, which was my first historical fiction work, and that definitely required a lot of research. The nice thing, and partially why I choose the topics that I choose, is because the subject matter is somewhat slice of life. I can wrap my arms around it. It's not so huge like a war or an entire, existence of maybe like the Great Depression or something where there's so many parts to it. These are a real slice of life of New York or world of, or national history. And I know that eventually I'll start seeing the same big ideas, and then I'll know that my research is done. But yes, I definitely, for the Subway Girls and for this book, did the same process of research. Although for the Subway Girls, I interviewed actual women who were Miss Subway's winners. I didn't do as much in terms of personal interviews of people who had been at the 1939-1940 fair, although I did watch some of those accounts online.
Got it. And I guess once the research is done and you're ready to start writing, what does that look like?
Gosh, so authors typically fall into two camps. And when you have your other authors on, you can ask them this question, whether they are plotters or pantsers. And that's what we tend to call ourselves, or a hybrid of the two. So a plotter is somebody who spends a lot of time before they start writing the book, outlining, plotting what they're going to write. A pantser is somebody who flies by the seat of their pants and just kind of says, okay, I'm going to write about two young women at the World's Fair, go. And they start, and the book takes them. They believe that the creative process is all in the journey of just sitting down and writing. I am the former. I am a plotter. I'm a little bit of a hybrid. I don't know everything that's going to happen when I start writing, but I definitely follow a construct of what makes readable fiction. And so I know that I'm going to start with an inciting incident, and then I'm going to take my characters through a character arc where they experience conflict. There's conflict resolution, there's more conflict, there's highs, there's lows. There are different plot points, there are different tent poles. It's a beat format. And not to say that novels should be formulaic, but they need to follow a certain path if they're going to be commercial fiction, because that's what readers want, and that's what keeps the pages turning. And your characters need to go through a journey, and they need to change. By the end, they need to be different than how they were at the beginning. So I do all of that before I even start writing the novel. Sometimes I'll do mini interviews with my characters. I'll actually fill out character profiles of them, so I feel like I know what makes them tick, what they want, what has been their hardships in life. And all of that informs the character development as I'm writing. I do all of that long-handed, on paper with pen. And it's only when I actually start writing the first draft that I go onto my computer and start typing. And I do that for any of you writers out there. I do it on a program called Scrivener, which is a really robust and wonderful platform, because it's not the scrolling like in Microsoft Word. Each chapter has its own file. So it's a wonderful resource. I write my first drafts very, very quickly, 2 to 3 weeks, I can get it out, but that's working all day. I'm a very fast typer. Always halfway through my writing, I've gone somewhere that I didn't expect, and so I end up throwing away my outline and having to start over from the middle. And then once I'm done writing, I go back and outline what I actually wrote and make sure that there's consistency. So So it's somewhat complicated, and it changes for every book. For instance, The Subway Girls was dual storyline, meaning I had the odd chapters were set in 1949 and the even chapters were set in the modern day. And so I had to make sure that the chapters lined up with the arcs of the characters. And then I do several revisions, and then I send it to my agent, and there's more revisions, and my editor, and there's more revisions. So it's definitely a process. The whole thing from inception of idea until I turn it into my, until the final draft is with the publishing house is probably about 6 to 12 months.
Got it. And was We Came Here to Shine closer to 6 or closer to 12?
It was closer to 6 because I had written another book before then that I thought was going to be my 4th published novel. And that book just didn't work out. And to meet deadlines, I had to kind of work more quickly on this book than I thought. I had done all the research, but it was a little bit faster process because I had also worked out what the themes were from the book that didn't get published.
Got it.
Somewhat. It's a long story, but it's a little boring, so.
All right, and I noticed that your books tend to focus on women and their ambition. And I know the inscription of We Came Here to Shine is really nice. It's for the women who paved the way and for the women who inspire me to be bold. So can you tell us more about that? Like, why do you like to focus here? Can you tell us about the women who inspire you?
Yeah, there's so many. I mean, it's interesting because people ask me all the time who my favorite authors are, or more so what books have inspired me to become an author. And I think it's less what books have inspired me to become an author, and it's more what people have inspired me to follow my dreams. And when I was growing up, I didn't think that I wanted to be an author. I actually thought I wanted to go into advertising. And after Penn, I went into marketing and communications, working for nonprofit organizations, advertising agencies, magazines, and internet companies doing corporate communications. And then when I had my first son, I have 3 boys. They are 19, 17, and 16. So a sophomore in college and then a sophomore and senior in high school. When I had my oldest son, I stopped working full time, but started writing freelance. And then just started writing novels 10 years ago when I turned 40. So it was definitely a second phase or a third phase, depending upon how you look at it, career. But that was because I had followed the careers and lives of so many women who decided that they were just going to go for what they wanted, even no matter what they told themselves or no matter what society told them. And now those are people like Michelle Obama, who her book, I really loved it. And I'm listening. I know you guys aren't allowed to talk about politics because it's a nonprofit probably. So I'm not going to talk about politics, but I will say I'm listening right now to Barack Obama's book. It is so good. I highly, highly, highly recommend it. I don't know anybody's politics, but no matter your politics, it's a really interesting behind the scenes book. But yes, my characters are all women who are ambitious, who are bold, who are following their dreams. And that's just my favorite topic. And I really love looking at the middle of the last century and studying the women who were born in the teens and 20s and even 30s, because I find the obstacles that they faced to become the women who they wanted to be was so hard. And I think of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who was born in that time, and what she accomplished, but what she had to deal with for that. And I love writing, my last book was Dual Storyline, because I love juxtaposing a woman from that time and a woman who might be in her 30s or 40s now, and seeing what has changed for women in the workplace from then till now, and what has stayed the same. And so much has stayed the same, right? But there's been so much evolution. And I just find it interesting topics to discuss with friends. And so I love exploring that through my writing.
And I think I have just one last question for you, and that is about the map at the beginning of the book. And I I know I was taken by it. This is probably too small for people to really see, and I have a virtual background, so I'll stop trying to do that. But can you tell us a little bit more about that map? Thank you. That is much better.
So when I'm reading a book for which setting is a huge part of it, I really love a map, and I refer to the map a lot when I'm reading a book. And so I thought it was very important to include a map in the front of this book. So I first started by looking at maps that already existed, and there are many for the World's Fair. This is one that I bought off of eBay, and I love it. And it was actually an insert in the New Yorker magazine. But the problem with this map, and I even tried to get the rights to it to reproduce it, but it would not reproduce well on a spread in a paperback, and it shows all of the buildings for the World's Fair. And so I knew that using an existing map was not going to work for what I wanted to accomplish. So what I ended up doing was I commissioned a map. I hired an illustrator. I found her on Instagram. It turns out she lives in Milan, Italy, and luckily speaks fluent English, but she had done a lot of work for American companies, which is how I found her. And we had such a blast working on this map together. It was really one of the best parts of putting this book out. And what we decided to do was to represent in a way that there were hundreds and hundreds of buildings at the World's Fair, but really only highlight the buildings and the places and the attractions that my characters went to during the course of the book that were important to the storyline. So it started off by sending her photographs from the internet of those buildings. And she came back and she developed different wayfinding strategies, which is important in map making. And she showed me her illustrations, and she had different layers. And it was her idea to put images of Vivi and Max where their workplaces were in the map. And so that's how it came about. She sent me, actually, that's it in the background. My friends actually got one blown up for me for my birthday, but this is a color version. Again, I know it's backwards. This is a color version of the map. And readers have told me that they love referring to the map as they're reading. So I'm really, really glad that we decided to go forward with that.
Yeah. Wow, that's a really interesting tidbit about it. I feel like there's so much about writing books that we don't even think about, like the illustrations. And I know you have a lot of pictures in here too.
Yeah. So those so unfortunately for fiction writers, we have to secure the rights for our own photographs and actually pay for the photographs. Maybe some higher level fiction writers don't have to do that, and nonfiction writers don't have to do that. But for fiction, if you want to include photographs, you have to get the rights. So I have about 7 or 8 photographs in here that when you read the book, you'll be happy to be able to refer back to certain things to see what they look like the Italian pavilion, which features prominently in the book, or the Westinghouse time capsule, the parachute jump, the baby incubators. And so that was fun. It also gave me access to some of these experts, these people who collect World's Fair memorabilia, to license some of the photographs. The New York Public Library has one of the largest archives of World's Fair memorabilia and photographs, so I work with them, and also the Smithsonian to get a photograph from them. So that was fun. That was cool too.
Wow. And all in 6 months. That's really very impressive.
Yeah, thank you.
Awesome. Well, I'm now going to open it up. If anybody wants to share questions for Susie in the chat, if you want to unmute yourself and say your question out loud, feel free.
Did Germany have a pavilion at the World's Fair then?
Very, very good question. So FDR so one thing I should say is there's so much history about the fair that I can share. And if we don't have, if the questions stall a little bit, I can show you a couple pictures that are interesting. But FDR himself is the one who approached all the countries to have them sign up. And eventually 60 countries had pavilions at the fair. Some were very large and freestanding, like Italy and France. Some were part of a hall of pavilions where they just had a section. Germany did not have one. The first country to sign on, and the one who spent the most on their pavilion and was the largest pavilion, was the USSR. However, the war broke out in the in September of 1939, and the fair extended to the summer of 1940, and many countries did not keep their pavilions in 1940. So the fair very much did affect the war very much did affect the fair. And what was interesting is that there's a lot of, I wouldn't say controversy, but there's discussion about the fact that the theme of the World's Fair was the world of tomorrow. There was a lot of talk about unity and the world coming together. And, the World's Fair, the government pavilion was the basis for Walt Disney to form Epcot. There was just this whole idea of countries coming together. And when the war started, people were like, they just saw the problematic aspect of the message that the fair was trying to give right before war broke out. So no, but Germany from the very beginning did not want to dedicate the resources or the time or the effort. They just obviously were focused on different things at that point. And the fair, so the fair it started on April 30th, 1939. It was only meant to last till October 31st of 1939. But halfway through, they realized that they were not going to make the number of attendees that they had originally anticipated. And many of the concessionaires complained to the Fair Corporation because they weren't going to recoup their investment. So at that point in August, the Fair Corporation, in addition to lowering admissions prices, decided to extend the fair for a second year. The fair was very different in 1940. It was less about technological advances and science, and more about entertainment. It was a little bit less highbrow, but they did recoup some of their investment. It was not a financial windfall, this fair, at all. And that's been a problem with World's Fairs in general. There is something called the BIE, which I do not have a good French accent, but it's the Bureau International des Exposiciones. I speak Spanish, so I can't say it in French, but the BIE is the overseeing body for World's Fairs. And right now, then they're called expos around the world. Only in the US do we call them World's Fairs. But right now there is a sanctioned expo every 5 years. And there was supposed to be one in Dubai this year, starting in the fall. But obviously it was canceled because of coronavirus. And I think it's hopefully going to be put on next year. But one of the things that's very interesting now is that the one I think 5 years ago was in Barcelona, and it did not do well. And much like the Olympics, there's a lot of private and public investment in these fairs, and then people are displaced. And then what do you do with these buildings once the fair is over? Dubai did it very differently. Before they planned the fair, they planned what the buildings were going to be used for after the fair. And it was a really magnificent sort of urban planning exercise. They leased all the buildings to corporations, residents. And so it's a really interesting story if you're interested to look up kind of the Dubai Expo 2020. I hope I answered your question. Yes, Matthew.
Hi.
Hi.
First, I want to thank you for coming. And it's nice that you have a Penn connection. Many of us have Penn connections. I'm actually on the Penn campus right now. So.
Oh, you are? Why?
Because I work at CHOP, as do some of the other people on the call.
Oh, wow. Okay.
But I have two questions. So the first is about the process. So you got a lot of memorabilia. Do you sort of set up a scene where you're surrounded by your characters and parts of the map or the memorabilia to sort of like have that in your mind as you're writing?
I'm going to show you a picture of my desk. Are you from South Africa?
No, I'm from England.
Oh, gosh. I usually get that right. My brother-in-law is from South Africa.
My parents were at the 1964 World Fair.
Oh, wow. That's super cool. Okay, I'm going to show you a picture. This is my desk while I'm writing. And as you can see, I have multiple books open. I usually pick for each of my main characters, I pick an actress, whether it's a modern day actress or an actress in the past. And I kind of channel that character. So for Vivi, it was Esther Williams herself, the swimmer. And for Max, it was Katharine Hepburn. I wanted her to be really sassy and bold. But I always have snacks and tea. And you can see on the left side, I do have a copy of the Today at the Fair newspaper and some books open and an actual physical dictionary because I trust it more than the online ones. But yeah, I do sometimes put some of the things out because you're right, it does allow me to kind of immerse myself in the topic and feel like I'm part of it. I actually did smell all of the memorabilia to smell what 1939 smelled like. But yeah, it's neat to have those things. I'm just bummed that I couldn't share it with, people so that they could see them also.
One of my favorite authors is Ian McEwan, and when he was writing Chesil Beach, he had taken a pebble from the beach and had it on his desk, and it got caught. There was a photo taken by a journalist in which you could see the pebble, and he actually got into trouble because it's illegal to take pebbles off Chesil Beach. And
oh, wow.
he had to return the pebble. My second question is about sort of process, but more drive. So many of us think about writing a book or like to write or write, professionally or even personally. But what drives you to go through to actually deliver a book? What's the drive? Is it you're doing it for you? Are you doing it for your writers, for your readers? Are you doing it because it's like a goal-setting thing? What's the drive to the end? And is it all fun?
No, it's horrific. I don't recommend it. It's terrible. That's a great question. I think it's obviously different for every writer. And I think for me, it's been different for every book. When I wrote my first book, it was more of, okay, what's the next sort of creative and intellectual challenge that I want to take on? Well, how about writing a book? And I'd never done that before. I didn't know anything about how to do it. I ended up taking a course which helped guide me through the process. And that's where my first book began. And then since then, it's been more that there's been an idea that sounded interesting and it made me excited in my stomach. And I thought, okay, I can do this. There are always points during the writing process where I'm miserable. And then there are parts where, as you know, right? Like, and I'm sure happens to all of you in your jobs, you get into the zone and it's like you don't even see time passing. And what's so weird, and I don't even know how to articulate this to you, but I sometimes feel as if I'm sculpting, where I'll have a block of text and I'll be, chiseling a little bit away here and adding a little bit here. And it feels like that to me. But I can't say it's all great. And what keeps me doing it, I guess all the good parts of it, the writing of the end and having it come out. And I do love the creative challenge of it. But, I finished writing this book finished the first draft in April or May of 2019. And I haven't started a new book yet. And that's because I was just so burnt out. I had written 10,000 words of one book, about 30,000 words of another book, 85,000 words of a third book, and none of those are going to end up getting published. And so I just submitted a proposal to my agent yesterday of a new project. But I mean, I don't know what keeps me going in it. I think it's the sort of thing that if you feel like you have a story to tell and you want to do it, you just have to, as authors say, butt and chair. And that's all it is. You just put your butt in the chair and you have to start writing. And one of the best pieces of advice I ever got was in a Dani Shapiro book. And she writes about writing a short, bad first draft. Don't think that you're going to write the 85,000 words and don't think it's going to be good. Just set out to write a really terrible first draft, because that just gets you into the discipline and the routine of sitting and writing. So, and what I would say also is I didn't have a full-time job at the time. My kids were in school. I had my days to write. I think it's so hard for people who do have full-time jobs. But I've heard people join the 5 a.m. club where they wake up and every day at 5 a.m. they do nothing but sit and write for an hour. And so I think there are obviously ways to do it, but it's definitely got horrific aspects to it.
Thank you.
I hope that answered your question.
It did. Thank you very much.
But I will say that I'm going to blank on his name, but the Cutting for Stone, Abraham Verghese. Did you read that book?
My wife loves it. I couldn't get into it.
Oh, it's so good. But seeing that you're a doctor.
I'm a twin, so she wanted me really to connect to it, but I didn't.
Okay.
I hear it's great.
Yeah, really good.
Why? What were you going to say about the book?
No, just that it, why did I even bring that? I think just because you're a doctor.
Oh.
That's why. Any other questions? Let me show you a couple pictures while I have you that are interesting. Okay, so this is the New York Times on the day that the fair opened on Sunday, April 30th. This was the site of the fair before it got built. It was an ash heap that F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote about in The Great Gatsby. It was not an auspicious site. It was filled with garbage, and there was a lot of remediation that needed to be done. But Robert Moses, who was involved, who obviously formed Central Park, he thought that it was going to be this wonderful park when it was all said and done. This was the groundbreaking ceremony in June of 1936. The reason the fair came into being in the first place is because a man who was a civil engineer, oh my gosh, I just saw this blimp up there for the very first time in the top left. That's so interesting. I never noticed that before. A man who was a civil engineer came to some businessmen in New York with the idea for a World's Fair in that it could stimulate the economy of New York during the Depression. So that's how the idea came about. They formed a group of people, a committee that became the Fair Corporation. It was headed by a man named Grover Whalen. And this was the groundbreaking ceremony in June of 1936. Over the next 3 years, the building ensued. This is it in its, I don't know what year this was, but this was the Trilon and Paris Fair being built, and this was the fair in its completion. It was 1,216 acres, which is enormous. There were buses that ran through it. There were guide chairs, which were American Express sponsored, with men, young, attractive young men in pith helmets would push you in a guide chair because it was impossible to navigate the entire fair in one day on foot. But it was divided into different zones: government zone, food zone, transportation zone. And this is FDR himself giving the opening speech. You can see Eleanor in the bottom right. And the young man in the front left, just to our left of FDR, was the man who held his cane. And in the video of this, you can see FDR, you think he's done talking, and this man gets up like 3 different times to hand him his cane, and it's actually pretty interesting. But that's just a little bit of the history of the fair, which I find interesting. And on my website, which I'll put in here, there's a resource area with my books, and the one for We Came Here to Shine has a list of all the different books I read and the links to the websites that I used, and also a resource for book clubs if you do this with your book club.
Great. Well, seems like those are all the questions we have for you tonight, Susie. Thank you so much again for taking the time to speak with us. This has been really interesting and enjoyable. And thank you to everyone who joined.
Thank you all so much. It's so nice to have readers come together. And I wish you all a happy Hanukkah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I appreciated the history. I grew up near where the World's Fair is in Queens,
Yeah.
and certainly that big globe was a real focal point growing up. And for those of you who've ever been to the wedding in Terrace in the Park, that's part of the World Fair grounds. So it's just so interesting. But there was, I think that was put up for the 1964 fair.
It was, yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
So that's just so interesting. So thank you.
Thank you.
It's really neat to see the history behind it. It's intriguing. So I look forward to going to your website.
Thank you. And they do offer wonderful tours if you're ever out there. they do offer wonderful tours of the fairgrounds.
You know, it's like when you're a New Yorker, it's literally in your backyard and you never do that. I love going. I can't wait to tell my parents, you can go on a tour of the World's Fair.
Not now, but
Not now, although maybe they have a virtual one.
yeah, no, they do. There's wonderful virtual stuff. There's a company called Untapped Cities and Untapped New York, and there's a lot of wonderful content and virtual fairs on that website.
Can I ask you one more question? And this may be, I came a little bit late, so my apologies. Is your bookcase in the back intentionally color coded?
Yeah, I did that one day. I got a little bit bored and I color coded it. The first shelf, and I think the second shelf, but not the third, or not the second. Well, maybe part of the second shelf. Yeah, highlight.
It's really pretty.
Thank you.
Wait till my husband sees what I'm going to do with his office.
Yeah,
I can't wait. My husband's a rabbi.
Oh, you know, the problem is that I alphabetize my bookshelves. This isn't my main bookshelf. I have downstairs most of my books. But so it's hard to find certain books, and I tend now to know what color the jackets are, so I can find them somewhat easily. But I do prefer alphabetizing them. But I have here, my first row are books that I've read recently or books of friends that I like to keep nearby. The second shelf is my huge to be read shelf. And then the third shelf are more to be reads and then some other topical things. And I just have stacks and stacks and stacks of books that I want to read next. It's so hard to decide what to read. I just finished this book yesterday, Transcendent Kingdom, which is by Yag Yassi. She wrote Homegoing, which is one of my favorite books. But there's just so many. I'll show you two of my other favorite books recently. These are two other books I've loved recently. The Henna Artist by Alka Joshi. And she's a wonderful speaker, and she does a lot of speaking engagements. If you do a book club, she supposedly likes to speak at book clubs. And 50 Words for Rain by Asha Lemme is about a young woman who was born in, like, I guess in the mid 1940s. In Japan, her mother was Japanese and her father was a Black American serviceman. And it's really interesting about what that was like at the time, because it was not an accepted way to grow up in Japan.
Is that nonfiction or fiction?
No, it's fiction. They're both historical fiction.
Uh-huh. Really neat. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night, everybody. Thanks so much for coming.
Good
Thanks,
night.
Gila.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.